Hello, good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining us for the Office of the Tenant Advocate's Tenant Summit event entitled Let's Talk, Living in Changing Environments. I'm Cristobal Puig, the coordinator of the Education and Outreach team here at the Office of the Tenant Advocate. I'd like to welcome all of you to this event and review a couple of logistical issues before we get started. Today's event will be comprised of 3 panels with their corresponding subject matter experts. The panel discussions will be moderated by OTA's Policy Director, Director Joel Cohn. Throughout the event, we encourage tenants to ask questions in the chat boxes of whichever platform you're using, be it YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. OTA staff will be monitoring the chat boxes throughout this afternoon's event. At the conclusion of the panel discussions, Director Cohn will continue the dialogue with our panelists by asking them a series of questions. And then Nicole McEntee, the Education Outreach Policy Analyst, will ask the panelists questions presented by you, district tenants. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. If we don't have time to respond to your particular question, we will post contact information for the participating agencies as well as OTA at the end of the event. Please feel free to reach out and ask your questions that we weren't able to answer this afternoon. With that being said, again, welcome. And at this point, I will pass it over to the Chief Tenant Advocate for the District of Columbia, Johanna Shreve. Chief.
Thank you, Cristobal. Thank you very much. And good afternoon to all tenants in the District of Columbia. As Cristobal indicated, I am Johanna Shreve, the Chief Tenant Advocate. And I want to welcome you to our 14th, 15th virtual summit. This is the first time we've had the opportunity to hold a summit in a virtual environment. But we know that there are many questions and topics that you, the tenant community, talk to us about on a regular basis. And so we believe that it was important to provide a forum where some of these very, very challenging and complex issues could be vetted. So today we're going to have experts from a variety of agencies throughout the District of Columbia to join us and share with you information that hopefully will be helpful in your daily lives, answer some of the questions that you have posed to us over time. And we want you to, first of all, remember all things in life change. And change is something that we all have to get used to, as we've learned during the pandemic. So I encourage you to listen well, keep your minds open, and be a great participant today. As I conclude my statement to you in the opening, I wish to also invite now the director of our policy department, Joel Cohn, to take over. Joel?
Well, thank you, Chief Tenant Advocate Shreve, and welcome everybody. The title of this OTA virtual summit is Let's Talk, Living in Changing Neighborhoods. I want to begin with a word about the context for this discussion. Over the last several years, the OTA has received a growing number of tenant versus tenant complaints and inquiries that reflect hot-button topics in the media. Many are related to 2 policy developments in particular. First, Ballot Initiative 71, which took effect in 2015, decriminalized the adult use of cannabis within a person's principal residence, including a rental unit. However, this does not prevent landlords from prohibiting marijuana use as well as cigarette smoking at rental properties. Second, in 2018, the DC Housing Authority increased the government's payment standard for voucher subsidies. This made it possible for voucher recipients to move to parts of the district where rent levels are higher, thus into neighborhoods that were previously out of reach for renters with vouchers. Over the same period of time, complaints about tenants disturbing quiet enjoyment and creating nuisance situations for other tenants increased. A top issue was a tenant complaining about exposure within his or her own apartment to marijuana smoke coming from another unit. This issue generally did not raise any issues as to the alleged offender's voucher or non-voucher status. Another top issue, however, was alleged behavioral problems and possible signs of illness, often about a new neighbor. And here, many of the complaints did associate the problem with the new neighbor's voucher status. For sure, these matters touch on a host of sensitive and competes is to have a frank new living situations while acknowledging what we at OTA believe is a widely shared common understanding that there should be no stigma regarding a tenant's voucher status. Voucher status alone is not a cause of these tenant versus tenant problems. And indeed, tenants with vouchers also suffer from nuisances and disturbances to quiet enjoyment coming from other tenants. So to help us start the conversation, we are very pleased to have with us Lauren Pear, the rent administrator for the district at the Department of Housing and Community Development, who will discuss how does diversity impact rent control. Argatonia Weatherington, or RG Weatherington, the Assistant Attorney General at the Office of the Attorney General, who will discuss the use of marijuana in residential rental units. And Dorothy, or Dory Kerr, a social worker on the community response team at the DC Department of Behavioral Health. Dory will discuss how to best help a neighbor that shows signs of mental illness. A word about format. Each panelist will have up to 15 minutes for their presentation. Our goal is to save at least 30 minutes for the Q&A after all three presentations. As Cristobal mentioned, please put any questions you have into the chat box as they occur to you. Nicole McEntee will direct them to the appropriate panelist, and I'll have some questions for the panelists as well. So I now turn the microphone over to our rent administrator, Lauren Pear.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for inviting me to this forum, and thank you, Chief Tenant Advocate Johanna Shreve. I'm Lauren Pear, as Joel mentioned, and my name is on the first slide, and I'm the current rent administrator at the DC Department of Housing and Community Development. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a brief overview. I'm going to go a little bit fast because I tend to always put too much into my presentation, so I may skip over a couple of slides or go over them, touch on them briefly, but I just wanted you to have the information. So, you know, we have a set of laws that deal with the legal relationship between housing providers and tenants, and I've listed out some of the ones that we touch on a daily basis. I'm going to limit today's discussion to the Rental Housing Act of 1985, which is the statute that my office administers. We regulate rent control, which includes the rent stabilization program. Rent stabilization is commonly referred to as rent control, but essentially it's the regulation of rent charged and rent levels. Next slide, please. As I stated, I head the Rental Accommodations Division. We're part of the Department of Housing and Community Development. DHCD produces and preserves affordable housing. They increase home ownership opportunities. They revitalize neighborhoods and community development by drawing on federal and local revenue. We also provide resources to fund small business development. My division, as I stated, administers rent control and the rent stabilization program. Just a quick word, the administration of the act doesn't encompass setting policy, but we're responsible for implementing legislative and policy changes from City Council and also from the Executive Office of the Mayor. Next slide, please. These are I just summarized briefly the duties and responsibilities of the Rental Accommodations Division. I'll leave you all to peruse that at your leisure. Next slide, please. So, principal question is, what is rent control? Rent control is a broad term for legislation which restricts the amount of rent charged by a housing provider to a tenant. And it also limits the amount of the frequency of rent increases and how much rent can be increased. In the district, the legal term of art really is not so much rent control, it is rent stabilization. Rent control refers to the regulation of all rental housing through licensing, zoning, use, laws, and policy. Rent stabilization is the way that our particular jurisdiction regulates the housing market, the rental housing market. The Rental Housing Act has objectives that are stated in the act, which seek to address like a shortage of rental units, affordable housing, the cost of basic accommodation, protect low and moderate income tenants from the erosion of their income due to increased housing costs, give incentives for the development of new rental units and rehabilitating vacant rental units, continue to administratively improve the process of resolving disputes and controversies between housing providers and tenants, protect rental housing inventory from conversion to other uses, and also the erosion of a moderately priced rental housing while giving landlords and developers a reasonable rate of return. Next slide, please. Rent control, which I stated applies to all rental housing. It applies to rent stabilized housing as well as market rate housing. Under the Rental Housing Act, all rental property must be registered. And what registration means is that landlords have to acquire a basic business license and certificate of occupancy from DC. And then they register the property with my office. And the registration requirements apply, as I stated, to market rate rental housing and also rent stabilized rental housing. Next slide, please. Rent stabilization requirements pertain primarily to rent increases, how often, how frequent, and how much rent can be increased. Market rate landlords, housing providers rather, can increase rents to whatever levels that they can get under a lease agreement and what the market will bear. If a property is under the rent stabilization program, the amount and frequency are limited based on whether the unit is tenant occupied or vacant. And also housing providers may petition my office for authorization to increase rent levels on legal grounds, which could include capital improvement. They're making a substantial rehabilitation to the property, hardship, which relates to a reasonable rate of return on their investment in the rental housing, alterations, repairs, changes to services, and possibly by voluntary agreement. Next slide, please. What buildings are rent stabilized and which ones are vacant? Buildings that are constructed before 1975 are under the rent stabilization program unless the building qualifies for an exemption from rent stabilization. An exemption means that if it's granted, the amount of rent charged is unrestricted and the housing provider may charge market rates. The housing provider has to apply for a claim for exemption at the time the accommodation is registered with the Rental Accommodations Division. And certain accommodations are excluded from rent control and rent stabilization, meaning that they're not even regarded as rental housing. Next slide, please. The most common types of exemptions we see under the rent stabilization program, one, if the property is government subsidized. So any rental housing which is owned by the district or the federal government, or any accommodation which has federal or district subsidized financing. And the second type is new construction, for which the building permit is issued after December 1975, or if there are new units added to the building which were constructed, or there was a certificate of occupancy issued after January 1980. We also have a small landlord exemption. If a natural person, an individual person owns 4 or fewer units and doesn't have an interest in any other rental unit in the district, they can qualify for an exemption. And then cooperatives, associations, and cooperative owners. Next slide, please. So what is a housing choice voucher? Now, this is really outside of my bailiwick. I'm providing some general information about housing vouchers, but my agency and my office does not administer the voucher program. Voucher programs are administered by the DC Housing Authority. So I'm just giving you some general information just to give you an overview how this all works with rent stabilized property. Vouchers are federal government programs for assisting targeted groups such as family unification, home ownership, project-based, tenant-based, tenant protections, persons with disabilities, or even witness relocation. Today, I'm only going to be talking about housing choice vouchers in the rent stabilization program. The Housing Choice Voucher Program, which was formerly known as Section 8, is the federal government's major tenant-based rental assistance program for assisting low and very low-income families, the elderly, and tenants with a disability to afford decent, safe, and sanitary housing in the private market. Next slide, please. The Housing Choice Voucher Program is administered by the DC Housing Authority, also known as DCHA, and that agency receives federal funds from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The housing assistance is provided on behalf of the program participant. So the participant finds their own housing, which can include a single family home, a townhome, or apartments. Participants may choose any housing that meets the program requirements, and they're not limited to units located in subsidized housing projects. The housing subsidy is paid directly to the housing provider by DCHA and the family pays the difference between the rent charged and the amount paid by the government. The housing unit is selected by the participant, but it must meet an acceptable level of health and safety standards before DCHA will approve the unit. Next slide, please. So benefits to the Housing Choice Voucher Program to district residents. Using the voucher allows a tenant to access rental accommodations in neighborhoods which may not otherwise be affordable to the voucher holder. Tenants gain access to guaranteed rents, free marketing, for different accommodations, and stability. Tenants may desire a certain neighborhood based on personal decisions, such as being close to a particular school or district, the accessibility of features available in the unit, or proximity to retail establishment services or public transportation. Vouchers provide stability even when tenants experience income disruptions, such as we've experienced the last 18 months in the public health emergency. Voucher holders tend to owe less back rent, and there's improved access to safe and sanitary housing. For landlords or housing providers, the benefits are that they receive a market rate rent for their property. There's consistent rental payments from the government on a timely basis through direct deposits. There's targeted marketing and pre-screened tenants. DCHA has pre-screened the tenants, and there's consistent tenant base and stability during periods of economic disruption. And there tend to be higher occupancy rates in the buildings and fewer vacancies. Next slide, please. Housing providers are forbidden under the district's constitution from discriminating against tenants on the basis of source of rental income. Landlords are also prohibited from advertising they will not rent to voucher holders. Landlords can screen tenants so long as they do not violate fair housing laws. And it increases income and diversity in buildings and neighborhoods, and there's a decreased homogeneity and warehousing of people in project-based housing. Next slide, please. So how does a voucher work in a rent-stabilized accommodation? So what happens is that the landlord applies to participate in the voucher program. They are approved by DCHA, and the rental accommodation must pass necessary inspections. The tenant is screened and income qualified by DCHA. The tenant then locates a rental accommodation. They may be screened by the landlord, and they sign a lease agreement. If the housing provider leases a rent stabilized unit to a tenant using a voucher, the rental accommodation is deemed to be government subsidized and will therefore be exempt from rent stabilization. The landlord receives market rate rent for the unit, and the tenant pays the portion of the rent based on their income, and the voucher from the government pays the balance. The housing provider is required to obtain a basic business license from DCRA and file a claim of exemption with the Rental Accommodations Division. The tenant may live in the accommodation like any other tenant. There are no indicators whether a tenant benefits from a voucher, and that unit or accommodation remains exempt from rent stabilization so long as the voucher tenant remains an occupant. Next slide, please. When the tenant vacates the rental accommodation, the housing provider must register the unit with the Rental Accommodation Division, and the unit reverts back to rent stabilized levels. The rent level reverts to the level the landlord charged before the unit became exempt. The housing provider is entitled to take the annual increase under the rent stabilization program, which is the consumer price index for the DC area, metropolitan statistical area, plus 2% for each year the rental accommodation was occupied by the voucher tenant. Basically, the new level is reset at the level the housing provider would have been able to legally charge had the voucher tenant not occupied the unit. Next slide, please. So I was asked the question, is rent stabilization subverted under this system? And to me, that's kind of a policy analysis, and I'm an administrator. So and rather than give you my opinion, which I've tried very hard not to do, I've just listed the advantages and the disadvantages that I've perceived. Oops, I'm sorry, my light timed out, so my lighting may be crazy behind me. So the advantages. The advantages of the voucher program is it does advance rent stabilization objectives and purposes. Tenants have access to neighborhoods and accommodations that might otherwise be out of their reach. It stabilizes families and allows access to preferred services, schools, and transportation. The voucher program fulfills many of the stated legislative objectives of rent stabilization. Rental housing stock is made more available to certain designated income groups. The assistance maximizes individual choice. It assists small housing providers by allowing them to charge a market rate rent to offset high operational costs. Preserves rental housing stock when the owner might convert the use to the building to another use, such as a condo or cooperative or commercial use. There's an incentive for housing providers to provide housing to an underserved group of low and moderate income households. Landlords are required to maintain safe and sanitary properties, and it allows creativity in designing different types of living arrangements. For example, intergenerational and shared living experiences. Department of Behavioral Health individuals with supportive services may live in this kind of a situation instead of being relegated to a group home. Same for chronically ill individuals instead of being, put into hospitals or convalescent homes. And in many of the subsidized projects from my agency include these mixed income projects to introduce diversity and accommodations. The disadvantages are that rent stabilized units are removed from inventory. So it creates some scarcity. There are fewer rent stabilized units available for other types of tenants. There could be barriers to entry. Voucher holders can be stigmatized as, housing providers may not want to deal with the bureaucracy that goes with the voucher program. There could be racial and bias and income discrimination, which violate fair housing laws. Landlords receive the market rate rents, which disrupts the purpose and objective of rent stabilization. So we can't predictably regulate how often and how quickly rent levels rise. And it could create competing interests between voucher holders and other tenants, as their interests may not always be aligned. Next slide, please. So I was asked the question of why is rent control important in preserving affordable housing? Does it matter if the unit loses its classification as rent stabilized? This is really a policy kind of viewpoint. So again, I'm just going to give you some issues that could be considered a part of the analysis of whether rent stabilization is an affordability tool. So one issue is that the Rental Housing Act is designed to expire. It's not a permanent law in the true sense. It has to be renewed ever so often. Right now, I believe it's renewed through December 31st of 2030. Because rent stabilization was not designed to be a permanent solution to affordability, it's intended to be an economic tool to stabilize the rental market while other solutions, remedies, and policies are designed and implemented. There's the legislative intent is that it also is a contrast with using rent stabilization as an affordability tool, because the act does not necessarily foster an increase in rental housing, but it's rather to stabilize existing stock, discourage conversions of use, and encourage rehabilitation of vacant property. The Rental Housing Act, at least in its stated purpose and objectives, is not necessarily designed to promote diversity. And the current policy is that private markets are being used to fill the affordability gap right now. We're using tools like inclusionary zoning in certain areas, allowing for construction of higher density projects, and developing other incentives like tax credits to induce developers to construct new and affordable housing projects and units. There's also a tension with rate of return. We want to make sure that housing providers get a decent rate of return, but the question is, what is that? And that, there have been ongoing legislative proposals over the years to try to settle on what is a reasonable rate of return. Next slide, please. We also have an aging rent stabilized stock. Right now our rent stabilization program rests in older buildings that are 50 years and older, and some over a century. And they may be reaching the end of their usefulness and may need to be, reconstructed or substantially renovated. So the underlying purpose of the statute necessarily doesn't appear, to my reading, to protect diversity necessarily, but to stabilize the housing inventory and ensure that we have low and moderate income tenant demand for housing can be met. So for rent stabilization to become an affordability tool, it seems to me that policymakers and legislators should consider a next generation of laws and policy, which could include a comprehensive redesign of the rent stabilization program. I encourage all of you to engage in this discussion, not only with the Office of the Tenant Advocate, but also with your council member, particularly Council Member Bonds, who has oversight over my agency and is always interested in hearing ideas about rent control and rent stabilization. And the last slide, please, is just my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to call the Rental Accommodations Division, and you can email me. It's best to reach me by email. So I hope I didn't blast through this too quickly. Thank you for your attention, and I'm available for questions when we get to that portion of the program.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And now we'll hand the mic over to Argetonia or RG Wetherington to discuss the use of marijuana in residential rental units. RG.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank Mr. Cohn and Chief Tenant Advocate Shreve for having me here today. As Joel said, my name is RG Wetherington. I'm an attorney at the DC Office of Attorney General. I am in the Public Advocacy Division. My name and contact information is on the slide. And just as a brief overview, a part of what we do is what is colloquially called slumlord enforcement, and we also enforce the district's nuisance laws. So you can move to the next slide, please. As a part of my presentation today, this will be very brief. I am going to give you a brief overview of the marijuana laws in the city and how they, in the district, and how they interact with housing. So just very quickly, in 2014, the district passed Initiative 71, which decriminalized marijuana possession. And that happened, like decriminalization started in February 2015. And basically what that means is that it is not illegal to possess 2 ounces of marijuana or to consume marijuana in the district if you are over 21 years old. So just to be very clear, over 21 years old puts this in the framework similar to alcohol. So it is not legal for someone who is under 21 to possess or consume marijuana. Now, under the decriminalization framework, what that means is that a person can possess up to 2 ounces, and they can also transfer up to 1 ounce. The legal turn of phrase is without remuneration, which means they can't get any money for it. So if I have 2 ounces of marijuana, I could potentially transfer or just give 1 ounce away to another person who is who is 21 years old or above. So you can move to the next slide, please. So what does that mean for people in housing? That basically means that it's legal to possess marijuana if you're above 21, if you live in private housing. And by private housing, I mean any housing that is not owned by the federal government. So that includes the majority of apartment buildings or private residences in the district. It is not, however, legal to smoke marijuana in public space. So people, legally speaking, cannot post up, as they say, and smoke marijuana on the street corners. That is not supposed to happen. There are also rules that differ between district-owned property and federally owned property. So if you are on federally owned property, which to district residents is much of the area in and around the mall, where between the Washington Monument and the Capitol, most of that is federally owned land. And when you are on federally owned land, because the federal government hasn't legalized marijuana, an officer can come up to you and arrest you for possession of marijuana. For those of you who have questions about consumption and use of marijuana in apartment buildings and in private space, which I think is many of you, if someone in your building is smoking and you live in a non-smoking building, the way to enforce that or to try to enforce the building's rules is essentially by raising that issue with your landlord, because that becomes a private right of action. You should ask your landlord to enforce the lease of your neighbor if your neighbor is indeed smoking marijuana. For those of you who do live in a private-owned building and you do possess and you do smoke and you have marijuana cards, if you have a medical marijuana card and you need to smoke for whatever medical reason, under the DC Human Rights Act, you should be able to ask your landlord for a reasonable accommodation. You move on to the next slide, please. Yes. So that's just my brief overview about marijuana in the district. I'm more than happy to field any questions after the fact. If you have any questions for me or for the Office of Attorney General, please feel free to give us a call. The main number for the Office of Attorney General is 202-727-3400. Also, you can email the Public Advocacy Division at socialjustice@dc.com or socialjustice@dc.gov, or civilrights@dc.gov. Those two mailboxes, if you email one of us, it's all in the Public Advocacy Division, so you've essentially emailed all of us. But the social justice section, as I said before, primarily handles slumlord litigation and nuisance activity complaints, whereas the civil rights section handles issues for reasonable accommodations and violations of the DC Human Rights Act. Thank you, and it was a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you so much, RG. And we will now turn it over to Dory Kerr from the Department of Behavioral Health to discuss how to best help a neighbor that shows signs of mental illness.
Hi, thank you so much for having me talk today. Again, my name is Dory Kerr. I'm a social worker with the Department of Behavioral Health, the Community Response Team. Community Response Team is actually an integration of 3 different programs within DBH. So it consists of the Mobile Crisis Program, Homeless Outreach, and the Diversion Program. We are a multidisciplinary team. We have social workers, behavioral health specialists, and also certified peer specialists. We answer a 24-hour phone line. We are responding to individuals who are experiencing psychiatric and emotional crises, also concerns related to substance abuse. And we provide crisis risk assessments for those individuals, also supportive counseling. We provide consultation services, education on mental health and substance abuse. And we also do a lot of community outreach to different areas in the neighborhood. We provide a lot of education during those encounters as well for folks who are in need of behavioral health services. We also work to link individuals with ongoing mental health and substance abuse treatment if that's something we identify and they identify as a need. So we have multiple different private outpatient mental health agencies under the Department of Behavioral Health. We refer to those as core service agencies. And those agencies provide ongoing support. So psychiatric care, therapy, support groups, a lot of different services on an ongoing basis. Community Response Team is also just one arm or just one program within the Department of Behavioral Health. We provide a number of different services and have a number of different programs. We operate the Access Helpline. That's also another 24-hour phone line. They provide supportive counseling as well, linkage to ongoing services. They are the line that an individual would call if they want to enroll with one of those core service agencies. And we also have the 35K Urgent Care Clinic. They provide psychiatric evaluation and treatment on a walk-in basis. They're located 35K Street Northeast, and that's regular business hours. And that is a clinic for individuals who haven't necessarily established care with a core service agency or an outpatient mental health provider, who may or may not have insurance. Often they're recipients of Medicaid, and on a walk-in basis, they can come in and talk with a psychiatrist and a social worker to access services, receive medication, receive referrals to other services and programs as well. We have, under the Department of Behavioral Health, CPEP, that's the Comprehensive Psychiatric Emergency Program. They operate 24/7. Individuals can also walk in if they are experiencing a psychiatric emergency, and right there, talk with a psychiatrist, receive an evaluation, and receive treatment, immediate treatment. In addition, we also have the ARC, which is the Assessment and Referral Center. Individuals who are experiencing issues around substance abuse can also walk in there, and they can receive assessment and linkage to substance abuse treatment, depending on what the recommendation is. We can certainly provide additional information regarding all of those services over the phone. We can be reached by calling two different numbers, 202-673-6495. And then our second number is 202-673-9300. We're located here also at 35 K Street Northeast, and a lot of individuals walk in to see us as well. We're certainly always here if there are any questions. We know that this has been a difficult time for us all with COVID-19, with the pandemic. This has certainly introduced a lot of challenges. A lot of people are experiencing stress that they haven't experienced before. We're still learning about how this has really affected individuals' mental health and how they're coping. But certainly individuals are experiencing conditions like depression and anxiety, and issues related to substance abuse and being isolated. And so, we certainly talk to a lot of folks experiencing those kinds of challenges and conditions. Here we've continued to operate. So we've continued over here at the community response team. We've continued to see folks out in the community, respond to calls like we always have. Core service agencies, those outpatient mental health agencies, have continued to operate for individuals who are concerned about leaving their home and exposing themselves to the virus. There are a lot of options that have also been introduced, like telehealth appointments, so people can still access care even right from their homes. So we're certainly here for issues related to that as well. There are questions that were posed about exactly what to do when they're concerned about a neighbor who might have a mental health concern, and who to call. We are here 24/7, the community response team. If you're not exactly sure what to do, we're here for consultation. And if we think that the individual would benefit from some additional support, we'll take down all the information that you have, and we'll certainly make sure that we respond to that individual. If you're concerned, if there's an immediate safety concern, if this person is violent or aggressive, or you have concerns about your safety, we also often partner with 911 and the MPD. We correspond with them to cases often, and sometimes they're the first ones to call if there's an immediate safety concern. If you have a question about that, you can always give us a call, and we'd be happy to help figure out who's the best agency or program to respond. Is it us, or is it police, or is it both of us? So that's a brief overview of our program. I'm here to field any questions when we get to that portion. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dory. And I'm going to kick off the Q&A with a few questions that our team has. And first, Lauren alerted me that on the PowerPoint RAD's contact information is incorrect. And so we'd like to correct that. Lauren, the email address is dhcd.rad@dc.gov. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Correction. And Dory, so super important issues, and you mentioned during this COVID period in particular, certain issues have become more pronounced, if anything. And I want to give you the opportunity to sort of elaborate on the ways in which you see that COVID impact the most prevalent issues that your agency has. And I will round that out with a question that we have about a tenant who might feel on the receiving end of those issues and asks, what are my options if a neighbor on the property is behaving aggressively, loudly, violently, in a way that makes me feel unsafe, disturbs my peace and quiet in my unit, or on the property? So I asked a very general and a kind of a specific question, but handle that however you wish.
Sure. So as far as specific challenges related to COVID-19, the pandemic, we're all experienced challenges that we haven't been exposed to before. For individuals who are already struggling with mental health concerns or substance abuse, it's certainly had a toll on those folks. We receive a lot of calls, people struggling with depression, anxiety, or they've lost contact with the agency that they've established care with because they didn't know how things were operating. They are isolated. They've lost contact with their natural support system, with their friends, with their family. Sometimes they've been disconnected from the coping strategies that they've been able to use in the past, like going to their day program, or spending time with those friends and families, just being out and about, and not being able to do those kinds of things. For us, we're here for those individuals to answer their call. We can see them in person, which is something that for some of the individuals that we've seen, they've been disconnected from their social supports, from their formal supports. So they've really appreciated being able to see us, that we've been able to continue coming to see them in their homes or the place that they're most comfortable in. We were able to get in contact with those formal support systems, with their agencies. We've been able to let them know the challenges that these individuals are experiencing and get them reconnected with care. We've been able to problem solve, address any challenges that individuals have had when they're wanting additional support, when they're wanting treatment. Department of Behavioral Health is still operating, and we have been throughout the entire pandemic, continuing to provide that support and treatment for individuals who are in need. So the individuals come into us, sometimes aren't exactly sure how we're operating, and we're often able to reconnect those individuals with services. As far as the other question that you had, for people who are worried about their neighbors, who, sometimes they encounter people who are agitated, or, aggressive, or they feel intimidated by, sometimes a behavioral health condition is contributing to that. Sometimes, we don't know. Sometimes there's disruptive disruption going on in a unit for other reasons. Sometimes it's a domestic violence situation. Sometimes it can be kind of difficult to figure out exactly what's going on. But for those individuals, I would recommend calling us. We're here for consultation. We're here to, discuss those different situations. We ask that, when folks are calling us, that they're able to provide concrete information as far as what they're observing. Just describing exactly what they're seeing and what makes them think that this could be related to a person's mental health. And also, we would say, in addition to calling us, depending on the safety concern, it might be a call to 911 as well. And also alerting their property management, because their property management office may be aware of the situation, may have a little bit more information and detail to provide to us. And there may be some kind of action already taken place that property management is aware of and that tenant may not be. So we often collaborate with 911 and property management offices to address some of these issues and concerns. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dory. I'm going to stick with you for what might be a tough follow-up question. And if you want to say OTA can figure that out when we advise the tenant, that's perfectly acceptable, but I'll ask the question anyway. In general, quiet enjoyment is a part of the kind of package of goods, as the case law says, that a tenant is entitled to in their implied warranty of habitability in the lease. And what I'm getting at there is that there will be occasion where it's perfectly appropriate and maybe necessary for the tenant to call on the landlord to take appropriate action when there's a nuisance situation and a disruption of quiet enjoyment. Do you have any sort of wisdom or words of caution or advice to tenants to kind of distinguish between when the landlord should be called on for the tenant who is being disturbed, rather than seeking out or advising perhaps some other course of action along the lines of what you've mentioned?
Well, I think often it's both. Often it's a call to us, and often it may be a call to property management or a landlord, depending on what the situation is. I would say that the tenant really believes that this is because of a mental health concern, or the person appears to be experiencing some type of emotional distress, that sometimes having us involved gets us to come out to that person. We would be able to assess the situation, assess the individual, make a recommendation for a level of care, and present those options to that individual. And sometimes helping reconnect that person, or helping that person access mental health services or substance abuse services can help alleviate some of their emotional distress, some of the reasons for the disruptive behavior, which could be part of the solution. Sometimes landlords have an idea of what's going on, and they have access to that individual's emergency contacts. They have, maybe they've been made aware by the person themselves as far as their history and supportive services that have helped them in the past. And maybe they've already been in contact with us. So I don't believe it's, always a punitive kind of thing to get in contact with a landlord. Sometimes that can enable this individual to access support and treatment and behavioral health services. What I would say is maybe a call to us first, and then we can kind of explore those options and what is most appropriate.
Right. Very helpful. Thanks so much. I'm going to move on now to RG. And RG, thanks for that answering. I thought a pretty difficult question about reasonable accommodation. And the question being, for somebody who lives in a non-smoking building, the landlord has explicitly banned marijuana use and cigarette smoking in the building. Can the tenant who has a medicinal need claim a reasonable accommodation in order to have the rights to use medicinal marijuana in that apartment building? Did I understand that correctly, that the answer is, yeah, the tenant actually can claim a reasonable accommodation in that instance?
Yes, that is my reading of the DC Human Rights Act. If you have a need for medicinal marijuana for whatever health or health purpose, you should be able to get a reasonable accommodation. And like some things that a landlord can do, just, to be solution oriented, is that there are some such things as no smoke, ashtrays or things like that. There are ways to quell the smell of marijuana in the unit and outside of the unit if it is causing problems to other people in the building. So there are solutions here that will allow, people who don't smoke and people who do smoke to exist together in harmony.
Got it. Okay, very helpful. Thank you. And what made the question a little bit difficult in my mind is that, and I'm glad you mentioned the DC Human Rights Act, reasonable accommodations are sometimes associated with the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Fair Housing Act, which are federal laws. And as I think you mentioned, marijuana use is still forbidden under federal law, and therefore applies to public housing. So can you speak to that? And what is the situation is different, I take it, for a tenant in public housing anyway, just by virtue of them living there, much less the reasonable accommodation.
Yeah. So this is like pretty basic, just like a federalism issue. So federal government, as I said before, has not legalized or decriminalized marijuana. So when you are in a US government-owned building, you're under a different sovereign than you would be in private DC space or in the District of Columbia space. So you have a different set of rules. Now, the question is, the question becomes one of, I guess, how do I want to say this? What is the likelihood of things being enforced? I don't know what is the standard of people being enforced in US government-owned buildings, but the likelihood of a person, like there being any type of criminal enforcement for marijuana on private space by the Metropolitan Police Department, if you are above 21 or your possession of under 2 ounces is nothing. It's perfectly legal. If you have over 21, if you are under 21 years old and you are in possession of up to 2 ounces, it is my understanding that MPD's policy is just to confiscate. So like those are like the differences between the two. It's just that when you're in a federally government-owned building, you're subject to federal rules and regulations, as you mentioned before. If you're in a private building that is owned by a private citizen in the District of Columbia, you're subject to district laws, and under the district law, marijuana is decriminalized.
Got it. Thanks. And I'm also going to ask, this is really, we don't have the Office of Human Rights on this panel, but in terms of the process, I have a question here regarding the process for requesting a reasonable accommodation. Do you have any advice on that?
No, I don't. Most of the time when people need reasonable accommodations and they do come to the Office of Attorney General, we typically direct them to legal service providers. So we would direct them to Office of the Tenant Advocate, the Legal Aid Society, Bread for the City, not Housing Counseling Services, but Rising for Justice, agencies and groups like those to help in individual needs, because just so people know that OAG in the housing context primarily deals with issues that are systemic in a building. So system-wide problems that will affect multiple tenants in different parts of a building across a building. We typically don't deal with individual one-on-one issues, and for things like reasonable accommodations, we won't handle those directly. We would typically refer a tenant to one of the many wonderful housing advocates groups in the city.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask Lauren, it's a little bit of a retread from your comments, but we get a lot of questions about how vouchers actually work in a rent control building. And can you just sort of recap and speak to how the rent control rent level is impacted when a voucher tenant moves in? And the question that we have, with that is, can a landlord charge a tenant with a housing voucher a higher rent than other tenants?
Sure. So the short answer is yes, and put a pin in that because I tend to forget, it was kind of a two-part question. So the way that it works, and again, I don't administer the voucher program. That is the department, that's the DC Housing Authority. People mix us up a lot. So, information that I have about vouchers is very general. But my understanding of how the system works is that once the landlord has applied to be a participant in the program, and the tenant has also applied to be a participant in the program, both have been screened and approved by DCHA. The tenant now has their voucher in their hand. They go hunt. The tenant goes and hunts for housing in the marketplace. If a tenant selects a unit that's currently under rent stabilization, the landlord can then apply to my office. They accept the tenant. They sign a lease agreement. The tenant then submits a registration claim for exemption form to my office, claiming that the property will be exempt from rent stabilization. When a property is exempt from rent stabilization, what that means is that the landlord is legally able to come out from under rent stabilization and charge market rate for that unit. Now that rate is agreed upon with the housing authority, so it's not just some random rate that's set with the tenant. So, the landlord will then charge typically, I don't see why they wouldn't charge a higher rate than what they would be able to get for rent charged under the rent stabilization program. The tenant remains in the unit. They pay, the voucher holder pays their portion of the rent. The government pays the lion's share of the rent. And that continues as long as the relationship, there's a valid lease agreement between the landlord and the voucher holder. Did I answer your question, Joel? I think I did.
Yeah, but I have a follow-up, of course.
Of course you do, Joel.
Of course. So as you alluded to this as well, but when that lease with the voucher tenant is up and the HAP contract is done, you explain that the unit does revert back to rent control. And there was legislation, I believe 2018 or so, that instead of making the new base rent control amount, that higher amount that the landlord was able to get with the operating subsidy, which of course took it to market rent, there was an adjustment, as you explained, to make the unit still a little bit more affordable than it had been under the previous version of that law. About what the base rent is when it reverts to rent control after the exemption expires. And can you say again what that amount is?
Sure. So the way the system now, this was predated my tenure as rent administrator. So I'm not real firm on how the law used to be, but as I recall, my understanding is that when in the old, before the 2018 amendment that you're referencing, Joel, what happened is that when a property came out of voucher holder decides to move out, and the unit would come back under rent stabilization, but it would be at the level that the owner was receiving from the DC Housing Authority. So as you were saying, Joel, it took it up to a market rate, and then so it was completely probably not affordable. In 2018, council changed that, and basically what they've done is that during the voucher holder's tenure in the unit, as they occupy the unit, as we stated, the landlord gets the higher rent charged. The tenant moves out or the contract ends. What happens is that the rental unit goes back into rent stabilization. And let's say the tenant was there for a 3-year period. What the landlord is then allowed to do is that the rent charge it reverts to the level it was before it came out of rent stabilization. And the landlord is allowed to take an annual increase of general applicability for each year that the property was out of rent stabilization. And what general applicability is typically means it's the consumer price index for the DC metropolitan statistical area, which I know is a mouthful, plus 2% for each year that the tenant occupied, the voucher holder occupied the unit. So it's as if the landlord or the housing provider is receiving what he would have received had the property stayed in the rent stabilization program.
Got it. And I think that
I hope that wasn't too complicated.
I think that was good. We'll hear it in the chat if it was too complicated. We can go back there.
Yes.
I think in addition to the increases of general applicability, I'm not positive. I think the landlord can also take a vacancy increase. Does that sound right?
I'd have to check on that. I don't know.
Okay.
Just say I don't know. I'm happy to, if someone has that question, research it and then circle back.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Well, at this point, I'm going to ask Nicole if we have any questions that she wants to ask from the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who don't know me, I'm Nicole McEntee. I'm with the Office of the Tenant Advocate. We've received several questions in the various chats among the various platforms that this is being broadcast. But first of all, we've received a question a few different times about sharing the slides that were presented during this show. And I do want to mention that the video of this will be posted to our YouTube page once it's edited shortly after the presentation today. So if you need it to watch it again or to see it slower, please feel free to look at the video once it's posted, and you'll be able to see the slides from the presentations as well. But that said, the first question I have is for Ms. Wetherington from the Office of the Attorney General. And the question is, you touched on this a little bit about federal property versus private property, but would you consider a tenant with a Section 8 voucher living on private property as being prohibited to smoke marijuana in their unit?
So this is a very interesting question. So the prohibition, it depends on who's enforcing what. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program is administered, as Ms. Parris said, by the DC Housing Authority. Smoking marijuana is technically a violation of HUD rules because HUD is a federal agency and it is federal funding. So it would be up to the Housing Choice Voucher Program to either remove somebody from the program or try to enforce through the voucher smoking or use of illegal drugs, which includes marijuana, as a person who participates in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So this answer is very kind of a lawyery answer, which is if you have a housing choice voucher, the property you're in is still private property. However, the voucher that you're in there with would prevent you or preclude you from using marijuana. So take that as like however you will, but the enforcement for like the use of the voucher will come from the housing authority or from your landlord. It would not be something like, for example, if you were smoking marijuana in a private unit and you have a housing choice voucher, the Metropolitan Police Department wouldn't arrest you.
Thank you very much. And I have one other question for you, which is kind of a combination of several questions we've received, which essentially boil down to what do you do if your neighbor is smoking and you are subject to secondhand smoke, maybe in common areas that you can smell, or potential harm to you through safety and health concerns. And you know, several tenants have commented that you know, sometimes landlords will say that they don't want to even bother with trying to take a tenant who smokes to court in a non-smoking building because the landlord says, well, there's no point. The court's not going to, rule in favor of the landlord here. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit as well.
So this really is a question that your answer to this question depends on your landlord and, you know, how you interact with your neighbor and, you know, collegiality between people. It's if the landlord doesn't want to enforce and they're smoking in the common area and there's smoke that's getting into your apartment, maybe you can work with your landlord to get some type of accommodation for yourself. It's just like, you know, buying air purifiers or anything or something like that. But a lot of the times it's just tenants having to work with their landlords. Also, one thing that we do tell people, you know, inter-neighbor problems of all types, whether that is in apartment buildings and sometimes even in private homes, are private rights of action that have to be settled typically between two people. I got a call earlier this week from a person who was having issues, and it's just like those problems between you and your neighbor need to involve yourself, your landlord, and your neighbor. And there are private issues between the two or the three of you. So like one thing I would suggest too is if you are cordial with your neighbors, to just talk to your neighbors. If you are not cordial with your neighbors and don't want to talk to them, I think you should continually follow up with your landlord and try your best to come to a solution to the situation that can work for everyone, because it's important for all people to be housed. You know, smoking or non-smoking.
Very much. The next question I have is for the rent administrator. And the question is that, you know, as you spoke about, landlords have been filling buildings with voucher tenants, and often they're able to charge rents higher than rent control might allow at that time, which, you know, can really end up decimating the affordable housing stock. So the suggestion was perhaps there could be a limit on maybe a percentage of the amount of voucher tenants a rent-controlled building could accept. What would your thoughts on that be?
Well, that's really a policy kind of issue, not an administrative issue. So as a neutral regulator, I really try not to comment too much on policy. If that could be a creative idea for preserving rent control. And so I highly encourage the person who posed the question to talk to Councilmember Bonds' office, you know, and work with the reform rent control groups that are about and make that proposal. I also don't know if that would violate fair housing laws, because that idea might be in violation of fair housing laws because, landlords are not allowed to inquire as to the source of income when a person applies to rent a building. So, I think it's great to have, think outside the box, be creative. I would say touch base with Councilmember Bonds and the different reform groups, lobby groups to, keep the ideas coming about how to improve the program.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
And then I have a question for Ms. Kurd with the Department of Behavioral Health. It says voucher recipients should have social services available in the building, like a satellite office, or at least a caseworker that the landlord can be notified about in terms of contact information. Do you have a response to that, or is that a possibility?
that might be a better answer for a better question for possibly DHS or an agency that that deals with housing. I can say that the agencies that provide outpatient behavioral health services to individuals with a mental health concern or substance abuse concern do provide services out in the community. They are supposed to be meeting folks in their homes, in their apartments, in their buildings, out wherever they are. So even if they're not placed in the building, the core service agencies that I spoke to about earlier, those case managers are supposed to be seeing people where they are. Now, these services aren't forced on individuals. It's based on what they're seeking and based on what their preferences as far as the services and the treatment that they would like to be receiving. So, we wouldn't be able to force our services on individuals who are recipients of a subsidy, but those services are certainly there and available for individuals who feel they could benefit from them.
Thank you very much. Joel, did you have any additional questions?
Yeah, I can ask a few more, and I'll keep it one at a time and then ask you, Nicole, if you have anything in the chat that you want to get to from our audience. I'm going to ask, I guess, all of the panelists who, this is really a question that goes to an Office of Human Rights expertise, perhaps, but regarding rent control units, a issue that we commonly get are tenants who are concerned that because with the increased government payment schedule, voucher tenants can afford to live in more expensive parts of the city, including the larger rent control buildings west of the river, that landlords might actually be discriminating, arguably, against non-voucher tenants and taking voucher tenants in order to get the higher amount that they're entitled to with the government subsidy. And I guess the question for the rent administrator, not to throw our rent administrator into the mix on very contentious policy and legal issue, but I am wondering if RAD is noticing an increase, any difference in the number of exemptions claimed, perhaps, or where the exemptions are being claimed since, I guess, 2018 is the relevant year. And I'm also wondering, especially from OAG, if that issue is on the radar, has been put into the customer complaint, the constituent complaint hotlines at OAG, and if anybody generally has any comment on that, that they'd like to make about that issue. So I guess starting with the easier question is sort of the data question for Warren.
So data, as you know, Joel, is not necessarily our strong suit. We are heavily paper-based. And for those in the audience who are unaware, we're trying to enter the 21st century. And we're under OTA's leadership, and we are building a rent control database. So hopefully in the near future, I'll be able to press a few buttons and get that kind of information. But until then, we are paper-based. So no, Joel, unfortunately, we have not done that kind of an analysis to figure out where these exemptions are occurring. And also the way that our registration forms are set up, the way that the data that we do capture doesn't always elaborate. If it's subsidized, it's not necessarily as a building wide or by unit. So no, we haven't. The short answer is we have not done that type of an analysis. So I can't tell you where this is occurring, how often it is occurring. What I have noticed, and this is anecdotal, is that there do seem to be competing interests between voucher tenants and tenants with, that are paying, under the conventional rent stabilization program. One of the things that I've noticed is that, you know, landlords are trying to leverage capital markets. They want to prove to their banks that they can obtain as much rent as possible that can be captured under the district system. And so sometimes I've seen a few cases where they are pushing voluntary agreements. And so, of course, the non-voucher tenants have a vested interest in not entering, maybe possibly, I mean, I don't want to couch this in declarative terms, but they may not be interested in the concessions or the benefits that the landlord may be offering, and they want to keep the rents at the same level, whereas the voucher tenants don't necessarily have a stake in that particular issue and may not be bothered by the fact that in a voluntary agreement context, the landlord may increase the rents. So it becomes a matter of competing interests. So there is a tension that I've seen in several cases where this seems to be building. I'm not sure what to do to address that. Maybe it has to be a question of legislative reform. I don't know. So I'm sorry, that's a rather incomplete answer, but that's about, you know, what I have are just my general observations as opposed to, you know, data.
No, that's helpful. Thank you, Lauren. And just to be clear on one just strand of that, it does go to another question that our team had, which is true or false. Just to clarify, a voucher tenant is not entitled to vote on a VA. They live in a rent control building, but the unit is not under rent control, and therefore the enjoyment of rights other than rent stabilization, of course, does not pertain. Is that a true statement?
No, I don't believe it's a true statement. The criteria under the statute is that someone is a tenant in the building. It doesn't state whether or not the person, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe when the Rental Housing Act was designed in 1985, this wasn't forecast into the future that there'd be different types of tenant populations within a single building. But just because a tenant lives in an exempt unit does not negate a vote.
Okay, thanks for that.
Sure.
RG, do you have a comment or contribution to that one? To that easy question?
So one part of your question was, has OAG filled any constituent complaints? Typically, our civil rights section will field constituent complaints about source of income discrimination, but from my understanding, those complaints are coming from from people who are participants in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, not for people who are not. But just anecdotally, like in my own work in the buildings that we've brought suit against, it truly is a business model for people to purchase buildings at higher rates and to then plan to turn around and offer the vacant units in that building to people who are participants in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And I haven't really looked into the issue about whether or not that is discrimination source of, whether that, you know, is incorporated in the idea of source of income discrimination. But a part of the reason, like Lauren said, for people doing that is that when you buy a building, your lender wants to see a pro forma and they want to know your rate of return. Certain buildings on the open market are not going, certain units on the open market are not going to fetch as high of a price as they would if the person who lives in that unit is a participant in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So landlords do intentionally go out, especially if they're refinancing a building or financing the purchase of a building initially. They do plan to make those units voucher units because they will get a higher rate of return on the rent, and also their payment is guaranteed. So basically, they can ensure to the bank that they're going to get a certain rate of return on the building. I am more than happy to look into whether or not that constitutes source of income discriminations for non-participants in the Housing Choice Voucher Program.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Sergi. And I think you're essentially driving at a possible rationale that would make the practice arguably not discriminatory. But because there's a profit motive for it.
Yes, that is definitely where I have seen it. And current cases now, people who purchase buildings out of bankruptcy have said publicly that our intent is to purchase this building. And for the units that are vacant, we intend to lease those units to people in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, because we need a certain rate of return on those units to be able to get a mortgage to buy the building. Also, it does, raise the policy question of, the competing interest in affordable housing. Does the Housing Choice Voucher Program in some way diminish overall the number of affordable units in the marketplace? I don't know, but that is just a question that it has raised, and it has raised with tenants and tenant advocate groups that we've come in contact with who work on our buildings as well.
Yeah, just to underscore, that's to point out arguable positions on either side of that issue, which you're looking into. So that's great. We appreciate it. Nicole, do you have other questions from the chat?
Yes, we have one more question, and it's for the Department of Behavioral Health. So Ms. Kerr, and the question is, if a voucher holder is clearly exhibiting behavioral health issues, like verbal or physical assault, who should we call? Who could you contact as a resident?
So I would advise to give us a call. We're that 24-hour resource, 202-673-6495. So we're for the Northeast side, Northwest side, and then we have 202-673-9300 for the other sections of Northeast and Southeast. Either number will get you to the right place. So we're a great resource. If they're seeking to file a formal, complaint about that individual, that's a little bit outside of our wheelhouse. We would mostly be concerned about the emotional or mental health concerns or substance abuse concerns that the person is exhibiting, and coming out, doing an assessment, figuring out the level of care, providing a recommendation for that, and helping that individual get access to services and treatment if that's what they need.
Okay. Nicole, do you have any other chat questions?
I believe that's about it, and I think we're about 5 minutes to go, so we probably need to wrap up.
So it's time to wrap up. Okay, got it. Well, I'm just going to say, before throwing it back to our Chief Tenant Advocate, I'm going to say thank you very much for covering so much territory very impressively to the panelists, and thanks to our stakeholders and everybody for participating today by listening in and giving us your questions in the chat. If there's any questions that we do not get to, as Cristobal mentioned at the top, please be sure to get us those questions. We'll want to address those. And we ask that everybody stay in touch with OTA on the policy issues, and as well as if you have any legal issues that you want to discuss with somebody on our legal team. And with that, and thank you, Nicole, for your services here. And I'll throw it back now to Chief Tenant Advocate Shreve.
Thanks, Joel, very much. And let me thank all of the panelists for covering some of the tough issues today. I think that we have got this conversation on the landscape one more time, and hopefully the attendees learn something from all of you. We hope that if they have additional questions, that they field those questions to us so that we can impart them to you for guided responses. Joel, thank you for serving as the moderator, as you've done so many times. And Nicole, you for covering the chat and the questions. And to the audience, we want to make sure that you understand that we here at the Office of the Tenant Advocate are here for you every day, that we are here to listen to your concerns, and we attempt to ensure as government to make sure that we are governing in a way that gives you the right to decent, safe, and sanitary housing. I wish all of you good holidays in the future. Be safe. If you haven't been vaccinated, please do. With that, I'll sign off.